Welcome or welcome back to Trail and Ultra Running and Training. My name is Will France. I'm a personal trainer, running coach, nutrition coach, and whole goal of this podcast is to provide better, good, more, whatever information so you can train well and have fun out on the trails where we want to be, right? If you like the information, I'd really appreciate if you hit subscribe or leave a rating or review. Or arguably even better, just share it with someone else. All of those things tell the robots that someone likes what I'm doing here, which allows more people to find it, which is the whole reason I do this in the first place. So if you do that, thank you. And if you haven't done that yet, please do. And anyway, let's get into today's topic and the constant quest for greater weekly mileage. And there is a long conversation to be had here where I don't think we need this constant effort to hit mileage in the stratosphere. It's just not necessary. Now we are ultra runners. We are trail runners. You should plan to run a lot. You should probably plan to run more than most people during your week, especially going into peak season, right? This is just going to be a requirement of the sport. And in my opinion, if you don't want to do that, we should probably find another activity, because the whole point of ultra running is to run really far, and the whole point of trail running is to run on the trails. And if you don't enjoy doing that, then maybe we should find something else to spend our precious free time doing, because there's so many things out there. But this constant push for greater weekly mileage is well founded, right? If we're going to get good at something, we should do it a lot. And back in the mid 1900s, 50s, 60s especially, a New Zealand coach named Arthur Lydiard pushed really high mileage to a lot of athletes, and he was very successful. New Zealanders were very good at that time period, end of sentence. But it's been 60 years, right? And maybe we should kind of accept that some other ideas are a little relevant, yet we're still stuck to some degree in this big push towards mileage. We have recently seen a big jump in speed work, including a lot of integration of things like low zone 3, low-level lactate producing work. The Norwegians do this a lot. And yet we're still stuck, and I keep saying that word, in the 60s in terms of constantly cranking out more and more miles every week. So I think there's a better way to look at this, depending on who you are, right? If you are going to be a professional runner, then we probably should plan for 100+ mile weeks on a fairly regular basis. Maybe not for trail and ultra. I do think a lot of the athletes in this space run a little less, but still a lot of the athletes at the peak do some version of forward ambulatory movement, like hiking. That's why I didn't just say running, because going directly up the side of a mountain would also count for this sport, and they do a ton of it, right? And because of the inclusion of vert, we are going to lose some level of total mileage because it's slower. So professionals in this sport probably are aggregating a similar amount of time on feet as Kipchoge, who runs 130+ miles a week. But while we can learn from a lot of great runners, and they set a guideline structure for a lot of how our running should look, our training shouldn't necessarily mimic theirs for a wide range of reasons. For one, professional athletes have some level of genetic advantage. It's required. And why is Camille Herron so good? She has years of training. She has lots of scientific backing for why her training works. she puts in a ton of work. And yet, if you hear her talk to, I think it was Dylan Bowman, I think it was on the Free Trail podcast recently about her Run Further event, she has a very specifically gifted aerobic system that is basically built for the exact type of running she does. She has a really high VO2 max. For the standard populace. She also burns a really, there's a point in your cardio where you cross over from a really high percentage of fat burning to a higher percentage of carbohydrate, and hers happens at a higher rate, right? So she can push harder in what would be zone 2 with a really high VO2 max. So her output is massive without a lot of penalty from a carb burning perspective. So she doesn't have to eat as much as someone who's trying to set the world record marathon. All right, so there's this crossover that she has that is very genetically dictated. Training has supported that, but she has this gift. And as a result, she's able to set 12 world records in a weekend or something. I don't know. It was a lot. I think it wasn't 12, but it was a lot. And that's just one example. Almost all professional athletes are going to have some level of very high talent from a very young age. And as a result, we tend to lean into the things we're good at doing, right? If you're really good at basketball from the age of 5, you tend to play a bunch of basketball. If you're really good at running from the age of 5, you tend to run a lot. And there are things that can derail this, but most of us tend to double down on the places where we're pretty good. For years, I doubled down on a deadlift. This is another genetic advantage, and by no means am I a professional at anything except coaching. But my lower leg is pretty short. My arms are fairly long for my height, and as a result, it's easier for me to pull heavy things off the ground. So my deadlift is much more disproportional to my lifting than anything else. And as a result, I doubled down on it for a while and didn't focus on other lifts because it's fun to be good at things, right? It's fun to be good at things. As a result, when we look at young athletes, they tend to do things where they're already pretty good. And if a person has a genetic advantage and then we start training towards some version of that as a child, and then you put in a ton of work over time, you are going to get very good at whatever you've been doing. Now, if that's the case, maybe we shouldn't use their standard or their numbers as our standard for training. Maybe we should, but I think probably not. Most people will not run 100-mile weeks in their life. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some of it's just time. Some portion comes down to the fact that if you're really good at running, you can crank out more mileage because it takes less time. And then some of it just comes down to the fact that most of us started running in our late 20s, early 30s, 40s, after years of inactivity or focusing on another sport. So we probably didn't have the advantage to start. We leaned into where we were good, or we got really focused on our career or family or whatever, continuing to disadvantage ourselves away from running. And now we're building from a place where maybe some of these targets, 50, 60, 80-mile weeks, just aren't realistic. So we can either dedicate a huge portion of our life to building a ton of volume, or we can accept the fact that we're probably not going to be the person that runs a 2:30 marathon, and we can do the best for our lives and our current body mechanics and try to do as well as we can do. And if that's the case, then we should lean into alternate but similarly effective training that can help us hit our goals without risking injury, right? And this is the big thing. So a couple things that would be important would be strength. And this is where one gets really demonized, and obviously it's my hobby horse because it's what I do every day. But strength helps you move better. So we have this conversation where some coaches would say something like, I would never add strength until an athlete gets to X mileage, and I've seen everything from like 50, 60, 80, whatever, because it takes away time from when they could be running. I'm going to get to that a little bit in a second, but strength helps you move better. So if you are struggling with things like an IT band issue that is often from your knees slightly caving in, means you can't really create hip abduction, which means strengthening that muscle will help you move better and get injured a little less. If your strength work doesn't do at least one of three things, it should build muscle, should build some strength, and it should help you move better. Ideally, for probably 99% of people, your strength work should help you do all three of those things. There's the rare instance where maybe if you're in a weight-relevant sport like fighting or cycling or whatever, and we don't want to build a ton of muscle, for most of us, unless you're getting paid to do that sport, you probably want to build muscle because when you're older, you will absolutely want to have more muscle mass to protect from things like osteopenia and osteoporosis and just like loss of bone density and loss of muscle mass as we age, that it will naturally happen. And if you want to be able to play with your grandkids on the floor or even get up from the toilet without assistance, then we need muscle mass. And it's really hard to build it when you're older, so we should build it early. Now, the other things like building pure strength, powerlifters don't care if they can move better, really. They don't care if they can get this full extension over their head. There's an argument to be made for they should, because a lot of the time if you move better, you're going to be able to lift more weight. But end of the day, their sport is moving very heavy things in 3 different movements. So if they're a little immobile, then maybe that's fine. But for most of us, our strength work should help us move better, build some muscle, and make us stronger. If it doesn't do those 3 things, then it's not very good. It doesn't mean that strength training is bad for runners. It means the strength programming is bad. The programming is shit, not the methodology. The solution isn't to avoid strength training until some random mileage. It is to get better strength programming. We have often this like limited understanding of human biomechanics, and we ask ourselves, like, what advantage does strength training really provide runners? Because we just see it taking away time. We see these big bodybuilders like my boss, who is, he's a great dude. He's not a runner though, and anybody who wants to run probably shouldn't be 300 pounds of like stacked muscle. But if we look at something, like I mentioned earlier, like IT band syndrome, caused often by a lack of ability to keep your knees unstable, because if they slightly cave, if we slightly had this like knee valgus, this drop in every step, even if it's like half an inch every step, that builds over time. Your IT band slightly creates a little more friction on the outside of your knee, and then we end up with pain, right? And the way to fix that is not running more, because you're just going to repeat the same movement pattern. Yes, we can pull back and slowly increase running volume again, pull back to where we don't have pain, and then increase running volume again, really focus on form, but you're probably just going to recreate the injury at a slightly higher volume. So let's say you're running 20 miles a week, you get IT band pain, you pull back to 15 miles a week, slowly increase your volume again until you get to 25 miles a week, you get IT band pain again, and we just play this hopscotch pattern forever. Like, there's a much better way to fix that, and it's probably not going to be something like banded tube walks. They'll also just delay the problem, because if we do a banded tube walk where you strap a band around your knees and shuffle side to side, yes, it helps you find your hip abductors a little better, like your glute med, so they might be a little more willing to fire and do their job, but it's not going to actually make them stronger. You run far, a tiny rubber band is not going to make you stronger, really. It might create more connection to a muscle, but it's not going to actually build strength. So what would we do? Sumo deadlifts, because they force you to pick up a lot of weight in relation to your body weight while keeping your knees out. And this will actually help build strength, build some muscle mass, while also building connectivity to those fibers in the side of your butt. And you will run better and probably have less IT band pain. Can't make any promises because the human body is weird, but this is how we would actually solve that problem. And that is just one example, right? Like all injuries are a result of putting more load on a tissue than it was able to tolerate. So to reduce injury risk, we either stop loading the tissue, which means we do that thing where we reduce mileage and slowly return, or we can make the tissue stronger. So when people say that strength training doesn't help runners, they either don't understand human movement, or they don't know how to program it, so they pretend it's not important, or they just don't want to lift weights, so they deny it. Any of these three things, right? And it's fine, especially the first one. If you don't understand something, the solution is to learn about it. But once we learn about it, we have to accept some progressive new ideas on training. There's a reason that most collegiate training programs are at least somewhat focused on strength. And it helps all sports, right? Like football used to not do strength work back in the 50s because they thought it would make you really muscle bound and big and jacked like my boss or like Arnold Schwarzenegger, because most of the guys who did a bunch of strength work at the time, because gyms just weren't that popular, were really big. They were not very athletic. They could not create much rotation because they were just trying to get huge. And now we know that strength training has been progressively adopted by all sports, from like football to baseball to tennis. And tennis players doing strength work who really care about tennis do not do the same strength work as a football player. A tennis player doesn't care how much they bench. A professional football player has to bench 225 for a lot of reps to get through the combine, right? So this is different, but they all do it. And it probably means that it's helpful for running as well. Our programming is just bad. And if we had better programming, then we would do better. Same idea for physical therapy. At its best, that's just low intensity, highly targeted strength training to help get over an injury. And then as you graduate from PT, you will add heavier, more relevant strength work to your goals, right? And you just graduate to heavier movements so the injury doesn't reoccur. This would be true for running as well. And if we look at some of the history, like let's look at Lydiard, for example, just kind of bring it back to where this started. Like he was a coach in New Zealand in the 50s and 60s. A lot of his people were like farm workers. And most of us sit at a desk and don't move all day. If you're a rancher or a landscaper or a house framer or whatever, you might not really do much strength work outside of a couple movements that would help you work towards your particular deficiencies in running. But that's so rare these days. Like I rarely see coach someone who's a full-time rancher. When I worked landscaping, I didn't lift often in the gym because I was moving around thousands of pounds of concrete. We did concrete, stone, landscaping, whatever. And now that most of my time is spent staring at someone as they lift heavy weights, my strength training is much more important again, like it used to be when I was injured all the time. Anyway, sorry, that's a tirade. Clearly a frustration point for me, but it is important. And it's important because it's important in your later life and it's important for your running. We just have to do it correctly. This cookie cutter strength programming on the internet probably isn't very good for you because we don't know you, we don't know your history, we don't know your background. And while a cookie cutter strength program on the internet might help you, including mine, for the record, I know I make these and I put them out for free, and they're free because I don't, because I can't guarantee they're really going to help you all that well. And if we get do a little research on ourselves to figure out like what we need to do to fix our particular movement deficiencies that we all have, then it will actually help you run better, right? So do your strength work or don't. You're over the age of 3 and you can make your own decisions. But we shouldn't say it doesn't work because we just don't understand how to program it. Another thing that I see demonized far too often is cross-training. Like, we can absolutely use cross-training, and this is a big pivot point on me, for me, in the past year, if I'm going to be really honest, because I kind of fell into the, like, you need to run a lot more, run better, and biking and cycling, whatever, probably isn't the best use of your time, and we just need to run, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of truth to that, as I said. Running is a highly skill-based activity. The more that you can practice a skill, the better you're going to get at running. But it's also a high cardiovascular activity, and it's going to be a while until we really develop the skill. Or if you're coming back from injury, redevelop the skill. And if we can't run much more at this point in our life for whatever reason, say you're running 20 to 30 miles a week, and when you increase volume, we get like mild amounts of knee pain, or we just like don't feel good, or we're pushing towards plantar fasciitis, right? Because our feet are weak or whatever. Maybe you haven't trained your tendons enough to run much more than 20 to 30 miles per week. And if that's the case, we shouldn't put the cardio on the back burner just because we are dedicated to nothing but running. If you were trying to build up volume and you're being responsible, then we can't just like crank from 20 miles one week to 40 miles the next week. So instead, we can get that 20 miles and we can put in some extra time on a bike or a stair mill or an elliptical or whatever have you. Some of these are a little more relevant than others. For example, if you are going to be a mountain runner, then it might be a good idea for you to get on the stair mill anyway, because especially if you live in a flatter part of the country or flatter part in the world, and you want to run something like the Wasatch 100 or Ouray or Hard Rock or any of these things, then you're probably going to want to get on the stair mill anyway, because there's a lot of relevancy to the race. But even if you aren't, and we're training for a flat Chicago Marathon, and we're kind of early in the training cycle and struggling to add some running volume, we can still hop on a bike or a stair mill. It's much less load on the joints. Yes, it doesn't have 100% crossover to running, but we can preemptively build a cardiovascular engine for when we can finally load more volume, because a lack of cardiovascular fitness is a big limiter for a lot of runners, especially earlier runners. If you're pretty good at running, then the legs might be your limiter. Go lift things. But if the cardio system is your big limiter, then we should build a bigger cardio engine. And if we can just get fitter, then you will get better at running, and you'll preemptively build that cardio engine for when your like bones, tendons, ligaments are able to hit that higher volume, right? We, again, hear these numbers, these like 50, 60, 80 mile, 100 weeks, and we don't want to add anything else until we hit that arbitrary number, because it takes away time from running. And it's silly. We can do a lot better than that. So if we stop trying to chase some arbitrary number of miles per week and train how you need to train to hit your goals by using this like wide array of equipment and techniques and strategies that we have, then we can hit our goals a lot faster with a lot less frustration, right? I'm probably going to go into a deeper dive on some of these things, but all of those are topics for another day. We're already pushing well over 20 minutes, and I try to keep these a little on the shorter side. So just to say, stop trying to hit some arbitrary number before we do other forms of training. It doesn't need to be this like either or mentality where we're constantly stuck. It can be a both and. And yes, we all have a very specific time in the day, but if you are at, like, strength training doesn't take that long, some extra cross training doesn't take that long, especially if you have some of it in your house. It just takes a little planning. So if you're struggling to add running volume and you're dealing with injuries, or you're just like not there yet, because the body does take a while to make some of these adaptations and get you there, then let's use some of these other methodologies so that we can get fitter, so we can get stronger, so we can train well without using valid but incomplete ideas from 60 years ago. Anyway, thanks for sticking around and listening to me talk about running. If you like this information, again, I'd really appreciate if you subscribed or left a rating and review or shared it or whatever, any of those things. I don't do ads on here. I don't do a Patreon. I just want this to be a good, somewhat accessible source of information. And I say somewhat because I know I get a little high topicy sometimes, but I just want you to be able to train better so you can do great on your next race and have fun. I am a coach, so if you want to work with me, please reach out. But the podcast is just a way for me to try to help more people than I'm personally able to coach. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another one. Appreciate it. Thank you again for listening to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Just a reminder, nothing you hear on this podcast is medical advice, and you should always speak with a medical professional before making changes to your training or your nutrition. If you enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, please leave a rating or review. It tells the algorithm robots that people like it, and that means more people will hear it. Or even better, just share it with someone who you think would benefit. If you prefer a video version, head to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Group on Facebook, or check out the Mountain Goat Endurance Coaching YouTube channel. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great next run.